Hi guys, welcome back to my channel where the gnomes live. This is Sharon Oyella, and today we're going to be making a weird sort of a weird project. This is a clam shell that I found. It's actually a gooey duck shell, and I found it on our local beach recently, and I had to do something with it. It was just amazing. The size of it was just amazing. So I turned it into a crochet caddy for myself. If you don't know already, I have another channel here on YouTube under my name, Sharon Oyella, and I teach people how to crochet toys and things like that. Anyway, I thought this project would be a fun way to ease myself back into that channel because I haven't uploaded there since 2019, but I'm back at it and I'll link the channel below. And there will be some crochet projects coming up for the gnomes as well, so I thought I'm going to tie everything together by making this guy. Two things to keep in mind before we get started. I realize not everybody is going to have access to these huge gooey duck shells like I have. I live on Vancouver Island in BC, Canada. So if you can't find yourself a shell like this, maybe you can build around a small box or something else. The video is just to give you ideas and to show you how I turn this clamshell into the octopus that you see in the video. And the other thing to keep in mind is I am not a Sculpey clay expert. I have rarely used this stuff in my lifetime. And I just wing my way along. So I'm not going to be giving you a tutorial on how to use the clay. I'm just showing you how I turn this humongous clam into the octopus monster slash crochet thingy. Alright, so that's all this video is for. It's a fun video. It's not a tutorial by an expert by any means. So just keep that in mind as we continue forward. Those of you who are subscribed to my channel and were waiting for the vintage suitcase continuation, it's coming, all right? I've fallen into like a slump of lack of motivation and creativity. So this octopus that I made in this video kind of got me out of that slump. I had to stop and just do a project for myself, and that's what I did. If you're looking for a smaller shell project, I have a couple here on YouTube. I'll put the links for you in the pinned comment below. Alright, so with all that said, I'm going to put the supplies list in the pinned comment below, and there you'll also find detailed timestamps. Alright, so I'm going to show you a complete gooey duck shell. So this shell here once was fused together and had the little gooey duck inside, and this is where it came out of on the side there. They always have this big hole on the side. But this other two pieces here that I ended up using, they actually don't match. They're the same size, and I found them in the same area, but they're not a complete shell. So they're a little bit off in the back there, and you can see the inside there, they don't match at all. The beginning of the hole is on one side here, and then on this side here. So I ended up with a smaller hole in the shell itself, so that's why I decided to use the ones that didn't match. Okay, before we get started, I'm just going to show you these little calcium deposits here is what the natural hinge is, part of the natural hinge. Just remove those because they will hang up the shell when you want to close it and stuff, because they have to be precise and you cannot get them that precise. So I just removed those little calcium deposits there. So I already did my shell that I'm going to use. And the next thing I have to do is stabilize the shell so when I'm opening and closing it doesn't wobble all about and fall over. So I decided to make these little feet, and when I first started the shell I was thinking of just making a monster, right? I didn't exactly know where that monster was going to end up in looks, so I started with the feet first, and they don't match the rest of the body that I ended up making, but I'm okay with that. And the Sculpey clay that I'm using, I'm not very used to it. I don't use Sculpey clay on the regular, so I'm not the best for giving tips and tricks and all that. I just kind of wing my way along. So I got the shape of the foot itself, and then I added these little balls on top to create the toes. So I did end up separating, you can see in the front there, separating two sections that gave me 3 toes. So that was the first slit there, and then I made a slit right here, and then I added a ball on each of those other 2 slits as well, and then shaped them into the toes that I wanted. And then I wanted to take it a step further, and I needed a little bit of help with some visuals, so I did Google monster feet, and I found the image that I liked, and it was this one right here. And just taking a look at this one, I knew where I needed to raise up parts of the toe. So I took another little piece of clay and made a longer piece out of it, and it just stuck it right on top like that, and then worked it into the rest of the toe and added in details as I went. So I'll use a tool as well once I get this blended in and make a separation there and get the top parts blended in. And once that was done, then I wanted the toenail, of course, and just to get the basic shape started, I used a shell. You can use anything. And then I placed my sculpting tool on top, and I'm pulling the clay towards me, towards my thumb there, just to create the separation of the toenail and the toe. Once I got that pulled out, then I was able to take my tool and go underneath the toenail and add a little bit more separation there. So just sculpting as I go. And then once I had all that done, then I added in lines to give the rugged look of the toenail and also a shell-like texture to the top of the toenail. And then those did go into the oven and bake, and at the same time I did make a tail. And I realized after the feet were done I did need a tail to keep the shell from wobbling back and forth like this. So the tail helped quite a bit. Now this tail is going to change shape and size later on in the project. As I keep saying, I was just winging my way along here at this point. So this is a hard baked shell tail already. We're going to come back to that. But first I'm going to show you the rim that I made for the bottom of the shell. Now I do the same for the bottom and the top. I do the base rim first, and then we're going to add to it later. Okay, so I've already baked the bottom. I'm just showing you how that looks there and how it fits nicely back on there. So I'm not going to glue it in yet, but I'm doing the top now. So I had to do the bottom first and bake it because it's too hard to do two pieces and get the proper shape, and I have to make sure that the shell is going to close and everything properly. So now I'm going to do the top, and I rolled out a big long piece, and now I'm just forming it to the edge of the shell itself. So I just got to push it into place, and then once that's all done, then you have to carefully take it off and try to maintain the shape of everything as you go here. Place it in the pan and bake that. And you're going to see some paint on the tail and the feet, but I'm actually going to be changing that later. Anyways, let's move on to the hinge. I'm going to do multiple hinges. I'm starting in the back first because the shell's very heavy. It's going to need a few hinges here. Starting in the back with a nice wide piece of fabric. My E6000 bottle was dried up in the top, so I had to bust out the bottom there and get the glue out that way. So I'm going to spread it around the entire top of the hinge, making sure that I have it covering completely, and then I want to have full contact between the shell and the fabric. So I'm just going to keep spreading out the fabric there with my thumbs, as you can see, making sure that glue is being spread around properly. And now I'm going to do the bottom, same thing, going to get it completely covering between the shell and the fabric. And of course the line in between the shell, the fabric part, the line in between the top and the bottom is glue free. Okay, so that little area in the center has no glue on it. Now I'm pulling the top and the bottom hinge tight because the shell is closed. That's as far as the hinge will go anyway. So you want to pull that tight while it's closed, and then you can let that dry. And then once that's dry, I'm going to add a couple of hinges on the inside. Okay, I left it for a couple of hours and now it's nice and dry. I am going to have to address that top edge there with some glue, but we'll come back to that. I'm just going to add some hinges on the inside first. And the inside, you can see the center of the hinge, the fabric hinge, has no glue on it. So I'm just pointing that out. You want that to be free of glue so the fabric will move easily. Okay, so now I'm going to add my hinges on the front, and I ended up going with 3 bandage size strips. And I just put the glue on the one side there, and I'm going to put it right into the little, I don't know what you call this, little dip there in the shell on the top, making sure that there's full contact between the fabric and the shell. And now repeating the same steps for the bottom part of the shell, that little cave piece in there. Get a piece of fabric glued inside. And then I needed a little bit of extra help, so I put a piece of beechwood to hold the shell up while I glue in the other halves of the hinges. So again, just spreading that glue out as best as I can and placing it in there and making sure there's full contact between the fabric and the shell. And of course you want to make sure everything is closing properly. And I did the other side as well, like the other hinge. Now I'm adding a third hinge because I realized it needed a little bit more help. So I'm putting a third one in onto the side right here. Now these hinges, all 3 of them, I want them to be fully extended as I let the clamshell dry. So you can see it's sitting straight up. I pulled the hinges tight just like I did in the back. So I know that those hinges won't go any further when the shell is opened once the glue is dry. And check it out. Oh, I was so happy at this point that these hinges worked out as well as they did. Very, very happy with that E6000. So now I'm going to go around with tacky glue around the outer edge of the fabric just to make sure that those edges are permanently glued down because I had a little bit sticking up there. So I worked on the back and then I did the inside as well, working it in with my finger to make sure that glue is spread around evenly, and the edges of those hinges will never ever lift up. And now I'm going to glue in the gums, or whatever you call them, around the edges of the clamshell. So I'm just using a tool to get the glue in there and placing this on. And then I'm going to use as much masking tape as I need to make sure that there's full contact between the rim that I made and the shell. So pulling that really tight. And I'm going to let that dry for a couple of hours. Alright, so moving on, I'm making a couple of teeth. I really didn't know where I was going with this at the time. I did make the teeth and then bake them. And then I also did some eyeballs here that will go on the inside. Now when I first was working out the eyeballs, I was going to use 2 shells like this. So I just placed the clay in the shell and then I baked them so that and then I was going to use the shell as eyelids. But then I changed my mind because I thought it looked too much like a frog. Okay, so I was just showing you that was the option, the other option that I had. Okay, so again, E6000, then masking tape to hold everything in place. And with the eyeballs, going to make sure that I can keep, that the shell will open and close without any interference there. So gluing that in, and then the masking tape to hold everything in place while it dries. E6000 takes 24 hours to fully cure, but you can play around with it after a couple of hours. So I just let that sit there for a couple of hours, then we'll come back and we'll move on to the next step. Alright, so now I'm making the arms, and this is going to be the base to start with, and I was having troubles getting them formed to the shell and then pulling them off, so I put some saran wrap down first and taped that into place, and then I shaped the arms over top of that, and that seemed to help me out quite a bit. So I could get that off of there without having to mess around with the shape too much. So again, that was the base of the arms. I'm going to be adding clay on top of that after, but I did bake those so they would maintain their shape. Moving on to the mouth part, and again, I was just kind of winging my way here. Wasn't quite sure what I was going to be doing in the end, so I thought I'll just start with the throat hole and use some black paint. And then the tongue, if I was to do this tongue over again, I would add some taste buds. I ended up just putting in some texture with this little bottle brush type tool. And yeah, I would have added some taste buds on top, but I didn't do that. I think it still turned out pretty cool, but if I was to do it over again, that's what I would do. Anyways, just shaping it there. And then I did throw some paint on these eyeballs. I ended up changing the color later. In fact, in the next clip, you're going to see some pupils, brown pupils on the eyeballs, and I completely changed that later. So pay no attention to those. So just painting out the tongue before I glue it into place. And I do repaint the tongue later. It's just that I wanted to get the base paint down first. And yeah, that throat hole needed a little bit of help, so I'm just adding some edging around. And again, I was just winging my way, so it kind of like the ideas kind of built on themselves. So once I had that, the glue was dry, I ended up painting them, and then I just moved on to something else, and then we'll come back to the mouth again in a little bit. Alright guys, before we carry on, I'm just going to point out I have 3 arms on each side on the bottom shell. These are not sculpted around foil, okay? They're clay only. I probably should have used foil, but I didn't. The top arms, because they are bigger and I didn't want the tips to ever break off, they are sculpted around foil. So all 3 arms on the top have foil inside. And inside the mouth, when I did put the arms on there, there was of course uneven seams and all that kind of stuff. Later on, I'm going to put clay inside the mouth too and then blend everything together. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure I got that clear. And the top shell, I did not want to put anything in there because I wanted to maintain that shell look. I didn't want to touch that. I want to keep that natural. And the eyes, I thought I filmed this part, but I didn't. I did add another layer of clay around each eyeball itself, and then of course added the texture. And while I was doing this, I wanted to make sure I was able to close the shell without any interference. So you want to keep that in mind as you're building yours. So here's another arm. I've baked it and I'm placing it into its spot. Now, if I was to do this over again, the bottom arms would have been completely different. I would have done all the texture work and all that kind of stuff before I glued them in place. But like I said, ideas were coming to me as I was going along, so it turned out the way it did. But to save yourself a little bit of time, you can think about the texture before you add the arms or install the arms. So here's a top arm. It's already been baked and the shape has been held in place, and now I'm going to add another layer of clay over top, and I'm going to add the texture, which I use a little tool for. So once I got the clay all blended on there, I'm going to take a little ball point tool and just repeatedly poke it all over the top. Now the bottom part of the arm I'm going to be adding some suckers, so I just want to do the top part. And once I got all the holes in there, then I do bake it, and then I can add the suckers on the bottom. So very important to bake that first, otherwise you're going to end up losing half those holes that you poked in there as you're working the suckers in. So for the suckers, I just roll out a piece of clay in a long tube, and then I can take the tip of the tube off in any size that I want and then roll it in my palm. And that's how I did the variable sizes of tiny balls there. So I just get a good pile going in different sizes. And I should have looked at this picture before I started. I already got one arm done before I decided to look up the suckers and what they look like. But oh well, it worked out in the end. So I have to add liquid Sculpey to the already baked arm. And then you take one of the balls and you just place it on. And I'm using a tool to push it down, and then another tool to make a little hole in the center. Kind of, well, not totally the center, kind of off center. So I'm going to push that one down. I did flatten it out with my finger, and then I pushed it down with my tool, and then another tool on top to make that little hole. And then you bake that, of course. And I'm just showing you the added texture to the feet. So I had to do that after the fact, right? And I did the same to the arms. Now to save yourself some time, you'd want to add that texture before you install the arms, of course. I did it a little bit backwards, but it worked out in the end. So now I'm going to add the top arms. Now the top arms are a little bit heavier, a little bit trickier to add. So I thought I had filmed one part and I didn't. The bottom arms there, I did add some extra clay that act like a little bit of a cradle to catch that top arm as it closes, okay? So that's already been done and baked. So now I'm doing the top part. I'm going to install the arm. So I had to add some liquid Sculpey, and then I'll add my clay over top of that and work that into the shell. And then I'll add liquid Sculpey to the arm and then push that into the clay. Anywhere that you add clay to the baked clay, you want to add liquid Sculpey first, so it bonds together while it's baking. So I added the liquid Sculpey, and then I'm going to add more clay. And I just kept adding the clay until I felt that the arm is going to be permanently held in place and that it was pretty strong. So once I got all the clay on there, then I stabbed it 1,000 times with that tool to give it the texture, and then back into the oven it went. This clam shell has been baked so many times, but you do what you need to do, right? Alright, so I did the bottom edge with the extra clay and then texture, and I also did one half of the mouth on the inside, so we can do the other half together. So I'm going to add the liquid Sculpey all around the inside of that mouth, and I'll take a thin piece of clay and I'm just going to mold it into the mouth all around the teeth and under the tongue and all that. And then once that was done, then I could go ahead and add the texture, and then back into the oven it went. And now I'm going to do the top rim. So again, I'm just showing you the Sculpey, liquid Sculpey goes around. And then I just added, I didn't really know how I was going to do the top, so I just added little bits at a time. If you have it all figured out beforehand, it would save you a lot of time. For myself, I just kind of winged my way along. Alright, so once that was done, now it's time to add another arm. And you can see I used foil first, and then I put the clay around the foil. So I was just taping it into place to make sure when I opened the shell that the arm wouldn't hit the table or anything like that. So these are all things that you want to figure out before you bake them. I also wanted the arms to be holders. So you see my crochet hook in the one arm and my scissors go nicely into the other arm. So once I had all that figured out, now I could just cover that foil up with the clay. Now attaching this arm, I did it a little bit differently. I used hot glue to hold it in place. Now the hot glue is just temporary, right? It's just an extra set of hands for me to hold it in place while I get the clay on there. So I was just giving you another option of adding the arm. And then of course the liquid Sculpey goes around, and then the clay right over top of that. And I attached a new tail the same way, so some hot glue on there and then liquid Sculpey and clay around that. And I actually added quite a bit to the tail. And then I decided to add a little cradle to the top of the tail here. So when I open up the shell, the top of the shell, that back part of the shell is sitting in that cradle. So it takes some of the stress away from the hinges. And then once I had all that figured out, then the texture, and then back in the oven it went. Then I decided to add some teeth inside that mouth and a little bit more gums around the teeth So long stretched out tube there, and then push it all in. And I add a little bit more to the back of the tongue. I also added a little throat thingy in the back there, that little ball that you see hanging down, but with my added sea glass later I ended up taking that out. Alright, so the top of the shell, I'm adding in a little piece of clay to hold my little tiny scissors and some pins. And you see where the scissors are sitting up against, there's a little piece there. I thought I'd film that as well, but I didn't. Just another little piece of clay that I added there to hold the scissors in place when I close the top of the shell. So that was already glued in and baked. So I'm just making the holes for my pins now. So I'm just adding in, I think I added like 6 or 7 of these pins. And then my crochet needles, a couple of holes for those as well. And then behind the eyeballs, I decided to use a little button magnet. So I sculpted some clay around the button magnet and then adding the Sculpey clay, or the liquid Sculpey, to the back, and then pushing that into place. So this little tool here, this thing with the brushes on it, has a metal back. So I was able to use the magnet to hold that in place. And then I added on each end cradles for my crochet hook. I could use 2 hooks or a crochet hook and a pin. So you can see little pieces there that hold my crochet hook very nicely, and then I can use one for a pen, which I always seem to be looking for when I'm about to write a pattern. So this might help. Always have a pen in place. Alright, so now we're about to permanently attach the feet. So I did hot glue them in place, so I had to play around with placements, of course, and then once I had that figured out, then I hot glued them in. And now I'm going to add in the clay around the feet to permanently attach them. So again, that's liquid Sculpey, and then I can work the clay in around them, add the texture, and then back in the oven it goes. Alright, my friends, that brings us to the end of part 1. In part 2, we're going to finish up the guy and paint him and all that great stuff. That link should be popping up on your screen. If it's not, just look in the pinned comment below, click the link, and I'll meet you over there.